The airport was filled with the wails of mothers, the excited chatter of fathers, and the tear-streaked faces of younger siblings. Aisha stood among them, her heart pounding as she watched her mother, Fatima, clutch her chest in grief. "My daughter, may Allah guide you," Fatima sobbed, gripping Aisha's hands tightly. "Mama, don't cry. I will come back rich," Aisha said, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Her father, Malam Sani, nodded firmly beside her. "This is your destiny," he muttered, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Work hard, send money home, and remember you carry our family's name." Aisha's younger brother Musa, only 10, tugged at her dress. "Sister, don't forget me, please. I could never forget you," she whispered, kneeling to hug him. "Be a good boy and take care of Mama, okay?" The loudspeakers announced the final boarding call for their flight to Italy. The group of young women, about 10 of them, exchanged nervous glances. Some looked excited, some terrified. They had barely set foot outside their small village in Kano, yet here they were, about to cross the ocean for work they knew little about. As they moved towards the departure gates, Aisha glanced back one last time. Her mother was on her knees praying. Her father stood stiffly, his face unreadable. Musa waved furiously, his small frame almost disappearing in the sea of people. Then, just as they stepped onto the plane, a face flashed in Aisha's mind, the stranger who had brought them to this moment. A month ago, a man had arrived in their village, driving a car so shiny that the children ran after it, touching it in awe. He was called Alhaji Musa, a tall, well-dressed man with dark sunglasses and a smooth, convincing voice. He had gathered families and told them about opportunities in Europe for their daughters, cleaning jobs, hospitality work, factory positions. "Your girls will send money back to you every month." Europe is a land of gold, he had promised, flashing stacks of crisp Naira notes. No one asked too many questions. No one checked the job offers. Poverty had already answered for them. Aisha's father had eagerly accepted the offer, despite her mother's protests. "Fatima, do you want us to die in hunger? Look at this house. Look at the roof leaking. Let Aisha go and change our story." And so they had packed Aisha's few belongings, taken a trip to Kano City for passport processing, and now here she was, seated on a plane, flying into the unknown. She glanced at the other girls. Some had dozed off. Others were whispering nervously. Beside her, a girl named Mariam from Kaduna leaned in. "Sister, do you really believe we will be housekeepers?" she asked softly. Aisha hesitated. She wanted to believe it, needed to believe it. "Of course," she answered. "Why else would they take care of our passports and tickets?" But deep down, doubt gnawed at her. When they landed in Rome, the first thing Aisha noticed was the cold. The sharp, unfamiliar air bit into her skin as she wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her. The airport was massive, filled with white faces moving in different directions. Waiting for them was a stern-looking Nigerian woman named Madam Blessing. "Welcome to Italy, my girls," she said with a forced smile. "Hope your journey was smooth." She led them to a waiting van. As they drove through the city, the wide roads and tall buildings amazed Aisha. She had never seen such a place before. But her awe quickly turned to fear when they arrived at their destination. Instead of the cleaning agency they had been promised, they were taken to a large house with iron gates. Inside, other Nigerian girls sat, their faces hollow and tired. "Why are we here?" Miriam whispered. Madam Blessing turned to them with a cold smile. "You are here to work, of course, but not as cleaners." The girls froze. "What do you mean?" Aisha's voice shook. "You will entertain men," Madam Blessing said flatly. Aisha's heart stopped. "No," she shouted, "that's not why we came." But Madam Blessing only laughed. "Foolish girl, you think your family sent you here for free? You owe us for your flight, your visa, everything." The room fell into stunned silence. Aisha felt her entire world collapse. She had been sold into a nightmare. For weeks, Aisha resisted. She refused to work for them, no matter how much they beat her, starved her, or threatened her. She swore she would rather die. Then one evening, her life changed forever. A man arrived at the house. He was not like the other clients. He was older, dressed in an expensive black suit, his dark eyes sharp and intelligent. The moment he stepped in, the room fell silent. Even Madam Blessing became nervous. "Don Giovanni, welcome," she greeted him with an exaggerated smile. Aisha barely understood Italian, but she could tell this man was powerful. "I need a girl," he said in a deep voice, scanning the room. His eyes landed on Aisha. He stared at her for a long moment before pointing. That one. Madame Blessing hesitated. She is new, stubborn, I said. That one. His voice was final. Aisha was dragged forward and pushed toward him. She held her chin high, refusing to cower. Don Giovanni smirked. Fiery. I like that. And with those words, Aisha's fate took another turn, one that neither she nor the greatest mafia boss of Italy could have predicted. Aisha sat stiffly in the back seat of the sleek black car, her hands clenched together on her lap. The leather seats were smooth beneath her fingers, and the air inside smelled of expensive cologne. The man driving, a bald, heavily built figure dressed in a black suit, had barely spoken a word since they left Madame Blessing's house. She could still hear the woman's shocked voice. You want to buy her? Don Giovanni, she's stubborn. She won't cooperate. How much? Don Giovanni had cut her off. But I don't like repeating myself, Blessing. The woman had swallowed her protest and quickly named a price. Aisha had been too stunned to react. She had been bought. Again. Now, as the car sped through the wide Italian roads, she stared out at the unfamiliar city, her fear growing with each passing minute. Where are you taking me? She finally dared to ask. The man behind the wheel, whom she had heard Don Giovanni call Enzo, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. To work. Work? Janitorial duty. Aisha blinked in confusion. Janitorial? She had expected the worst. A brothel, another house like Madame Blessing's. But cleaning? That was different. The car pulled up in front of a massive modern building glowing with golden lights. A large neon sign above the entrance read, Club Imperium. Music thumped from inside, a deep rhythmic beat that vibrated through the air. The parking lot was filled with expensive cars, and bouncers in black suits stood at the entrance. Aisha wasn't sure how she felt about that. Just do your work, stay quiet, and don't ask too many questions, Susan advised. Trust me, you don't want to get involved in mafia business. Aisha nodded slowly, her mind spinning. A room of her own. After a long night of scrubbing floors and wiping down tables, Aisha was exhausted. Susan led her to a small room at the back of the club. It's not much, she said, pushing open the door. Inside was a tiny space with a single bed, a small window, and a wooden dresser. At least it's yours, Susan added, better than sleeping on the floor. Aisha sank onto the bed, her body aching. Thank you, Susan. Get some rest, Susan said. Tomorrow will be another long night. As she lay down, Aisha stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. She had escaped one prison, only to end up in another. But something about this place felt different. And she had a feeling Don Giovanni was the reason why. Don Giovanni lay on his king-sized bed, staring up at the ornate ceiling of his luxurious penthouse. The dim lighting cast soft shadows across the intricate gold patterns. But his mind wasn't on the expensive details he had once admired. It was on her. The girl he had bought earlier today. Aisha. Her name echoed in his mind like a whisper of fate. Her wide, frightened eyes had met his for only a moment, but that was all it took. In his family, they believed in anima gemella, soulmates. It was an old Sicilian tradition passed down through generations of the Giovanni bloodline. A Giovanni man knew his woman the moment he saw her. And Don knew. The moment Aisha had looked at him, something deep inside him shifted. It was unfamiliar, unsettling, dangerous. She's the one. But what was he supposed to do with this knowledge? He didn't love. In his world, love was a weakness. Love got people killed. Love made men soft. He had spent his entire life building himself into something unbreakable, untouchable. He commanded fear and respect. He controlled cities, moved billions, had men willing to die for him at a snap of his fingers. There was no room for love. And yet, he couldn't leave her at Madame Blessing's house, where other men could enjoy what belonged to him. The thought of another man's hands on her made his blood boil. So he took her, not to bed, not to his home, to his world. A controlled world. A place where he could watch her without touching her, where he could keep her close without letting her in. A janitor? He muttered to himself. It was cruel, but it was necessary. She would work. She would suffer. And he would see if he could resist what his blood told him was inevitable. Just then, the door to his bedroom opened. Hera. She walked in without knocking, her silky red nightgown clinging to her curves, barely covering her long legs. Her dark hair tumbled down her back in perfect waves, and her full lips curled into a knowing smirk. You're awake, she purred. She moved toward him, slow and deliberate, her bare feet making no sound against the marble floor. Don didn't move. Hera had been his entertainment for years, a woman who knew what he liked, who knew her place. She never asked for more than what he gave, and that was why he tolerated her. She reached the bed and slid onto his lap, straddling him without hesitation. "You've been tense lately," she whispered, her fingers stroking his sharp jawline. He felt nothing. She leaned in, pressing her soft lips to his cheek, trailing down to his neck. Nothing. Before, this would have set his blood on fire. But now, nothing. Hera tilted her head, frowning slightly. "What's wrong?" Don didn't answer. Instead, he gripped her waist firmly and pushed her off him. She gasped as she landed on the soft mattress beside him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Get out," he said coldly. Her lips parted. "What?" I said. "Get out." His voice was calm, but the warning was there. Hera's pride flared, but she was no fool. She had seen what happened to those who tested his patience. She huffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Fine, she stood, adjusting her nightgown, and shot him one last look. "When you remember who you are, you know where to find me." She walked out, closing the door behind her. Don exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. His mind went back to Aisha. This is a mistake. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could stop it. Aisha pulled her thin sweater tighter around her as she followed Susan through the busy streets of the city. The cold Italian breeze brushed against her skin, and the sight of towering buildings, endless cars, and stylishly dressed people made her feel even smaller than she already did. This wasn't like home. The dust-filled streets of her village, the loud market women shouting prices of tomatoes and peppers, the warm embrace of her mother, everything felt like a distant dream now. She had been in Italy for just a few days, but she already knew one thing for certain. She wasn't here to be a waitress, a cleaner, or a house help. Something was wrong, and she was about to find out just how deep that trouble was. Susan, the only other Nigerian woman she had met, was her guide for the day. Aisha had met her at the club, and though the woman carried herself with a confidence Aisha didn't understand, there was kindness in her eyes. "Come," Susan said, grabbing her hand and leading her toward a small cafe. "We need to talk." They sat outside the cafe, and Susan ordered coffee. Aisha didn't want anything. Her stomach was already tied in knots. "So, you don't know where you are, do you?" Susan finally asked. Aisha shook her head. "Do you even know who Don Giovanni is?" Aisha frowned. "Don? You mean the man who owns the club?" Susan let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "The man who owns this city." Aisha's brows knitted together. "What do you mean?" Susan sighed and leaned in. "Aisha, listen to me carefully. You see this place?" She gestured at the streets, the cars, the people walking past them. "Everything you see? The businesses, the clubs, the banks, even the police? It all belongs to the Mafia." Aisha stiffened. "Mafia?" she whispered, almost afraid to say the word out loud. Susan nodded. "Yes, and Don Giovanni is not just part of the Mafia. He's the Mafia, the capo dei capi, the boss of all bosses, the most powerful man in the underworld, the one everyone fears." Aisha swallowed hard. "They say he has no heart. He doesn't forgive, doesn't show mercy. If you cross him," Susan ran her finger across her neck, making a slicing motion. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. "People disappear because of him," Susan continued. "He controls everything. Drugs, weapons, money laundering, politics. Even the law bows to him." Aisha's hands trembled. "Then why am I here?" she whispered.
Susan sighed. "Because he bought you." Aisha gasped, feeling like the air had been knocked out of her. "Bought?" Susan nodded grimly. "You think Madame Blessing sent you here for a simple cleaning job? No, sweetheart. The girls she brings here, they don't get to choose their futures. They are sold." Aisha's head spun. No, my family took the money and let you go. Just like mine did." Aisha's chest tightened. No, this couldn't be happening. She thought she was coming to Italy for a better life, not to become someone's property. She felt sick. "And Don," Susan continued, "he doesn't keep women unless they serve a purpose. You're lucky he gave you the janitorial job. That means he doesn't want to touch you." Aisha frowned, confusion mixing with her fear. "Why would that be lucky?" Susan leaned in closer. "Because if he wanted you, you wouldn't be cleaning tables." Aisha shuddered, hugging herself. Then she remembered something else, something that made her skin crawl. His tattoos. Back home, tattoos were rare. The only people who had them were gangsters, criminals, or people who had dealings with the dark side. Don was covered in them, and now, knowing what she did, she feared him more than ever. By 7 p.m., they returned to the club. The loud music thumped in Aisha's chest as she moved through the crowd, clearing empty tables and avoiding eye contact with the well-dressed men who looked at her like she was an object. She was quiet the whole evening, lost in thought. How do I escape this place? She didn't belong here. She didn't belong in this world of danger and secrets. She had to find a way out. She was so distracted by her thoughts that she didn't see the man standing beside her as she turned. Her hand, holding a tray of half-filled glasses, collided with his chest, sending the remaining drinks splashing onto his expensive suit. Gasps erupted around her. Her heart stopped. She turned slowly, her eyes traveling up the soaked black fabric past the broad chest until they met a face she recognized instantly. Don Giovanni. Aisha's breath hitched. His deep blue eyes burned into hers, unreadable. His jaw tightened. The world around her blurred. The music faded. Fear slammed into her like a crashing wave. Before she could even open her mouth to apologize, her vision swam. Dark spots danced before her eyes. And then, everything went black. She fainted. The office was dimly lit, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting shadows across the sleek black furniture. Don Giovanni sat in his chair, one hand holding a crystal glass filled with whiskey, the other resting on the armrest as he stared at the unconscious woman lying on the couch. His mind replayed the moment over and over again. She had looked at him, just one look, and collapsed. He exhaled, his jaw tightening. He had seen fear in many forms before. He caused fear. But this was something else. The doctor had come and gone, his words lingering in the air. It's just shock and fear, Don. She'll wake up soon. Let her rest. Shock and fear. His fingers tapped against the glass. What had they told her about him? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied her. She was beautiful, too beautiful for a place like this. Soft, innocent, untouched by the world he lived in. She didn't belong here, but she was his. Whether she understood it or not, she belonged to him now.
And for the first time in his life, Don Giovanni wasn't sure what to do about it. A soft whimper broke the silence. Don straightened, watching as Aisha stirred. Her eyelashes fluttered, her breathing uneven as she slowly opened her eyes. Confusion, panic, terror. It all unfolded on her face in seconds. She sat up so fast that she nearly fell off the couch, her dark eyes darting around the unfamiliar room until they landed on him. And then, tears welled up instantly. Please. Her voice cracked, and she quickly slid off the couch, dropping to her knees before him. Please, Sir Don, please, it was an accident. I swear I didn't mean to. Don frowned, setting his drink down. Get up. His voice was firm, but not unkind. She flinched. I'm sorry. Please don't kill me. Aisha's body shook as she lowered her head further, her forehead nearly touching the floor. I'll do anything. Just don't. Please don't. Don exhaled, rubbing his temple. Aisha, stand up. She didn't move. She was crying now, her hands clasped together in a desperate plea. I know I ruined your suit. I'll clean it. I'll pay for it. Just don't. I'm not going to hurt you. She froze. Slowly, she lifted her head, her lips trembling. You're not? No. She blinked rapidly as if trying to process his words. But they said. Her voice faded. Don leaned back, crossing his legs. What exactly did they tell you about me? Aisha swallowed hard. That you're the devil. A slow smirk pulled at the corner of his lips. Interesting. Her fingers dug into her dress. That you kill people. That you don't forgive mistakes. That if someone crosses you, they disappear. Don tilted his head. And you believe everything you hear? She nodded frantically. Yes, he chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Aisha sucked in a shaky breath. If you won't kill me, then what will you do to me? Silence. Don studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. Go to your room. Aisha. She hesitated. Go. When she didn't move, he sighed and pressed a button on his desk. Moments later, the door opened and Susan walked in. She took one look at Aisha on the floor, her tear-streaked face, and turned to Don. What did you do to her? She asked, hands on her hips. Nothing, he said coolly. Take her back to her room. Susan helped Aisha up, whispering reassuring words as she guided her toward the door. But just before they left, Don called out, Aisha? She froze. Next time, don't believe everything you hear. She didn't respond, didn't even look at him. And for some reason that unsettled him more than it should have. As the door closed, Don leaned back in his chair, staring at the empty space where she had just been. She feared him, not respected him, not admired him, feared him. And for the first time in his life, Don Giovanni found himself wondering, why did that bother him? Aisha stared at her reflection in the mirror, unsure if she recognized the woman looking back at her. She wore a deep red dress, short but elegant, hugging her curves in a way that made her blush. Her dark skin glowed under the warm lights of the club's dressing room, and Susan stood behind her, adjusting her wavy hair with a proud smirk. "You look like a goddess," Susan said, stepping back to admire her work. "I look different," Aisha murmured. Susan chuckled. "That's the point, babe. We work too hard in that damn club. Tonight is about fun." Aisha bit her lip. It had been weeks since she arrived in Italy, and every day had been filled with fear, uncertainty, and survival. But tonight she wanted to forget. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked as Susan linked arms with her. "Relax. It's just a normal bar. Not everything in this city is mafia business, you know?" Aisha wasn't convinced. Still, she let Susan drag her outside where a taxi was already waiting. The bar was lively, a different kind of energy from the VIP club where they worked. Here, there were no strict rules, no expensive suits, no whispered conversations about business and bloodshed. Just music, dancing, and laughter. Aisha sat at a small round table with Susan, sipping a fruity cocktail. The neon lights painted the place in shades of blue and pink, and the dance floor was packed with people moving to the beat. "See?" Susan grinned. "No Don, no Mafia, just a good time." Aisha smiled, relaxing. For the first time in weeks, she felt normal. Then he appeared. Tall, with slicked-back dark hair and a confident smirk, the man strolled toward their table, his sharp blue eyes locked onto her. "Buonasera, Bella," he said smoothly. Aisha blinked, looking at Susan for help. Susan raised a brow. "He's saying good evening, beautiful." Aisha turned back to the stranger. Thank you?" He smiled wider. "I don't think I've seen you around before. Are you new to Rome?" Aisha hesitated. "Sort of. Well, that's a shame. A woman as beautiful as you should be seen more often." She frowned. "Thank you, but I'm not interested." His smirk didn't falter. "Not even in a drink?" "No, thank you," he chuckled. "Ah, playing hard to get. I like that." Aisha shifted uncomfortably. She said no. Susan cut in, her tone sharp. The man ignored her, leaning closer. "At least tell me your name, Bella." Aisha's heartbeat quickened. Susan had had enough. She pulled out her phone and quickly sent a message. "To Seth. Get here? Now." Seth, Don's second-in-command and Susan's boyfriend, responded immediately. "Seth, on my way. Who's bothering you?" "Some idiot. Just hurry." When the boss walks in. Minutes later, the air in the bar shifted. Aisha didn't understand why at first. Then she saw them. Seth entered first, his presence alone enough to make people move out of the way. His sharp suit and cold stare were unmistakable. But it was the man behind him that made the entire bar hold its breath. Don Giovanni. His dark coat hung off his broad shoulders, his piercing eyes scanning the room like a predator stalking its prey. And then his gaze landed on her. Aisha felt her stomach drop. The stranger still trying to flirt with her had no idea who he was dealing with. "Aisha," Don's voice was calm, but it carried an authority that silenced everything around them. The man frowned, finally noticing the tension in the room. "Who is this?" he asked, looking between Aisha and Don. Don stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Someone who doesn't take no for an answer?" The stranger swallowed. I was just talking to her." Seth smirked darkly, and she clearly wasn't interested. Susan crossed her arms. "Exactly. So why are you still here?" The man looked at Aisha one last time before stepping back. "Sorry, I didn't mean any harm." Don's gaze didn't leave him. "Leave." The man didn't need to be told twice. The moment he was gone, Don turned to Aisha. "What the hell are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. Susan, however, wasn't intimidated. "Relax, boss. It's our night off, and you thought bringing her to a place like this was a good idea?" Don's eyes burned into Aisha. "Do you know what could have happened?" Aisha clenched her fists. "I just wanted to have fun," Don scoffed. "Fun? In a city filled with men who'd kill for the chance to own you?" Her stomach twisted. "Own me?" Don cursed under his breath. "Go back to the club, now." Aisha's cheeks burned with humiliation. "You can't tell me what to do," she said before she could stop herself. Seth let out a low whistle, and Susan bit her lip, trying not to laugh. Don's eyes darkened. "Oh, cara mia," he murmured, stepping closer. "You have no idea what I can do." Aisha swallowed hard. "Seth, take Susan home," Don ordered. "I'll handle Aisha." "Handle me?" she repeated, taking a step back. Don raised a brow. "You'd rather stay here and risk another man trying his luck?" She hated that he had a point. Fine, she muttered. He placed a hand on her lower back, guiding her toward the exit. The entire bar watched as the most dangerous man in Rome walked out with the girl who had stolen his attention. And Aisha? She wasn't sure if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Aisha sat in the corner of her small room behind the club, hugging her knees. She had barely slept since that night at the bar, and no matter how much she tried to erase Don's words from her mind, they echoed over and over. "You have no idea what I can do." And he had proved it. The next morning, she had woken up to find a new dress neatly folded on her bed, an expensive silk gown in the softest shade of blue. A note lay beside it, written in perfect Italian script. "Wear this. Be ready by noon. DG." Her heart had pounded in her chest. Susan had peeked into her room and whistled. "Damn, you pissed off the boss, and now he's making you his personal project." Aisha frowned. "What does that even mean?" Susan gave her a knowing look. "It means you belong to him now." Aisha had shivered. "No, he doesn't own me," Susan chuckled darkly. "Tell him that, babe. See how that goes." At precisely noon, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the club. Aisha stood frozen in the doorway as the driver, a tall man in a black suit, stepped out and opened the back door for her. "Signorina," he said, waiting. She glanced at Susan, who smirked and nudged her forward. "Better not keep him waiting." Aisha swallowed hard and got in. The drive was silent. No one spoke a word until they arrived at an upscale restaurant where Don was already seated at a private booth. The moment she saw him, she felt like she couldn't breathe. He looked impossibly perfect in his tailored suit, dark tattoos peeking out from under his shirt sleeve. His cold, unreadable gaze met hers as she hesitantly took a seat. "Eat," he commanded, motioning to the food already placed in front of her. Aisha's hands trembled. "Why am I here?" she asked. Don sipped his wine, watching her. "Because I said so." She clenched her fists. "That's not an answer. But it's the only one you're getting." She glared at him. Don smirked. He liked that fire in her. It was what had drawn him in the first place. She wasn't like the other women, those who threw themselves at his feet, desperate for his money, his power.
No, Aisha feared him, but she also had a will of her own, and that fascinated him. "Eat," he repeated. Aisha hesitated, then picked up her fork. As she chewed, she could feel his eyes on her. "Good girl," he murmured. She nearly choked. He chuckled. She hated how smug he looked. It didn't stop there. A week later, another car arrived, another note. "Be ready at 6. This time, he took her to a rooftop dinner overlooking the city. The conversation was different. "Do you miss home?" he asked, swirling his wine. Aisha looked down at her plate. "I don't know." "Liar." She flinched. Don leaned forward. "You miss your family. You miss your village." He tilted his head. "You miss being free." Aisha's throat tightened. "I'm not a prisoner," she whispered. Don smirked. "Aren't you?" She had no response. It wasn't a request. One night, after finishing her janitorial shift, she returned to her tiny room only to find her things packed. She turned to see Seth leaning against the doorway. "Boss says you're moving." Her heart stopped. "Moving where?" "His house." "No," Seth smirked. "Not up for debate, sweetheart." Before she could argue, 2 of Don's men took her bags and led her outside, where the familiar black car was waiting. The drive felt endless. When they finally arrived, she stepped out to see a massive villa surrounded by high walls and armed guards. A prison, a golden cage. Don was waiting for her at the entrance, hands in his pockets. "Welcome home," he said smoothly. Aisha's breath hitched. "Why are you doing this?" He stepped closer, tilting her chin up so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "Because you belong to me." She wanted to deny it, but deep down, she knew she had already lost. Aisha paced around her new bedroom in Don's villa, her stomach churning with nervous energy. She had never been in a house like this before. Grand chandeliers, high ceilings, expensive art that probably cost more than her entire village. It was overwhelming. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just Don's new pet project or the girl he had taken under his wing for reasons she still didn't understand. Tonight, she was meeting his family as his woman. The thought sent chills down her spine. "I don't understand why he's doing this," she muttered to Susan, who was lounging on her bed, sipping a glass of wine like this was the most normal thing in the world. Susan smirked. "Because he's obsessed with you." "No, he's not." "Oh, babe, he is. Trust me, I've seen Don with women before. He uses them, tosses them aside. He never brings them home." Susan leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "But you?" He's breaking all his rules for you, Aisha swallowed. What if they don't like me? Then that's their problem. Aisha bit her lip. You'll be fine, Susan assured her. Just don't embarrass him, don't ask too many questions, and don't let them see you're scared. Aisha nodded, even though she felt like throwing up. The dining room was something out of a royal palace. A long mahogany table stretched across the room, covered in silverware so polished Aisha could see her reflection. Candles flickered, casting a golden glow on the faces around her. The Giorgio family.
She recognized a few of them from the club. Don's older brother, Matteo, who had the same piercing eyes but a softer edge. His younger sister, Valentina, a stunning woman with long black hair who looked her up and down with quiet curiosity. But it was the elderly woman sitting at the head of the table that caught Aisha's attention. Nana, Don said, his voice softer than she had ever heard. His grandmother, the matriarch of the family. Aisha's heart pounded. So, Nana said, her eyes twinkling as she studied Aisha. This is the girl? Yes, Don replied without hesitation. Aisha's breath hitched. Nana reached out, taking Aisha's hand in her wrinkled one. Bellissima, she murmured. You have kind eyes, child. Aisha smiled shyly. Thank you. Nana's approval seemed to settle the tension in the room. Conversation flowed easier after that. They talked about business, about allies and enemies, about things Aisha only half understood. But what shocked her the most was Don. For the first time, she saw him not as Don Giorgio, the feared Mafia boss, but as a man who laughed at his sister's teasing, a man who listened intently when his grandmother spoke. And when he turned to Aisha, his eyes softer than usual, she realized something. He wasn't just claiming her, he was welcoming her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Don's control over her didn't waver. He dictated what she wore, where she went, even what she ate. Pasta or seafood? He had asked one night. I'll decide for myself, Aisha had snapped. His gaze had darkened, but instead of arguing, he had smirked. Then choose wisely, Tesoro. And just like that, she realized something. She had power. Not much, but enough. One evening, as she and Susan lounged on the villa's balcony, Aisha finally spoke her fears. I can't live like this forever. Susan sipped her wine. Then don't. What do you mean? Susan smirked. Use it. Use what? His love for you. Aisha's breath hitched. Don doesn't love me. Maybe he doesn't, Susan admitted. But he wants you. And men like him, they don't just want, they need. Aisha swallowed. You want freedom? Susan leaned closer. Make him give it to you. And for the first time since arriving in Italy, Aisha wasn't just afraid. She was curious. Aisha sat by the window of Don's villa, staring at the moonlit gardens below. Susan's words echoed in her mind. You want freedom? Make him give it to you. She knew what she wanted. She missed home. She missed her family. But she also knew that Don would never allow her to leave Italy so easily. His control over her was tight, and his fear of losing her was even tighter. But Susan had given her a weapon stronger than logic, stronger than arguments. Tears. And tonight, she was going to use them. Dinner that night was the usual routine. Lavish dishes, candlelight, and Don watching her with his usual possessive gaze. Aisha had barely eaten. You're not hungry? Don asked, slicing his steak. Not really, she mumbled, staring at her untouched plate. He frowned. Something wrong? She hesitated, then sighed dramatically. Nothing. His eyes narrowed. Aisha, I said it's nothing, she snapped, pushing her chair back and storming out of the dining room. She heard his fork clatter onto his plate, followed by his heavy footsteps behind her. What the hell is this? He growled as he caught up to her in the hallway. I just want to be alone, she whined, crossing her arms like a sulking child. Don stared at her, confused. Aisha had never behaved like this before. Fine, he said, stepping back, his jaw tight. Be alone. She went to her room and slammed the door, waiting. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Then bang, bang, bang. Aisha, Don's voice was sharp. She didn't answer. Silence. Then the door creaked open. What is going on with you? Don asked, his voice softer now. Aisha was sitting on the edge of the bed, head lowered, fingers gripping the sheets. And then she sniffled. Don froze. Then came the full breakdown. Tears streamed down her face as she sobbed uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking. Aisha, I miss my family, she wailed, covering her face. Don took a step closer, looking like a man walking into a battlefield without a plan. He had faced gunfights, betrayals, torture, but a crying woman? That was something he wasn't prepared for. Aisha, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. Come here. She shook her head and cried louder. He crouched in front of her. I didn't know you were feeling this way. Of course you don't, she sniffled, wiping her nose dramatically. You don't care. Don's eyes darkened. That's not true. She hiccuped. Tell me what you want, he said, exasperated. She sniffed again and looked at him with teary eyes. I want to visit my family in Nigeria. Don stiffened immediately. No, and then she wailed, louder, more dramatic. Don stepped back like she had slapped him. I just want to see my mama! Is that too much to ask? Don clenched his fists. He looked lost. Then, as if the situation wasn't already too much for him, he pulled out his phone. Susan, get here. Now. Susan walked into the room 5 minutes later, taking one look at Aisha, curled up in bed, sobbing, and then at Don, who looked like a desperate man trapped in a cage with a wild animal. What did you do to her? Susan asked, crossing her arms. Nothing, Don snapped. She just started crying. Susan sighed and turned to Aisha. Aisha, sweetheart, what's wrong? He won't let me see my family. Aisha sniffled. Susan turned back to Don. You idiot. Excuse me? You have two options, boss, Susan said, sighing. Let her go see her family or deal with her being moody for the rest of your life. Don's jaw tightened. Susan smirked. She's not just any woman, Don. She's yours, and if you don't make her happy, she'll make sure you suffer. Aisha peeked at him through her hands. Don exhaled sharply, then ran a hand through his hair. Fine, he growled. Aisha lifted her head, eyes wide. Really? Yes. We're going to Nigeria. Aisha blinked. We? Don scowled. Do you think I'm letting you go alone? Her heart skipped. You're coming with me? Damn right I am. Aisha wanted to jump up in victory, but she bit her lip, looking down like she was still sad. Okay, she whispered, sniffling again for good measure. Don sighed and rubbed his temples. Susan chuckled. Congratulations, Aisha, she whispered as she walked past. You just won your first battle. And Aisha? She knew it too. Aisha was glowing. For the first time since she arrived in Italy, she felt like herself again. She hummed happily as she packed her bags, twirling around the room. Susan leaned against the doorframe, watching her with an amused smile. You look like a child who just got the biggest candy in the world. Aisha laughed. That's because I feel like one. I'm going home, Susan. Home, Susan smiled. You've got him wrapped around your little finger. Aisha rolled her eyes. It wasn't easy. I had to cry like my life depended on it. And it worked. I should take notes, Susan smirked. Don walked into the room just then, his hands in his pockets. Are you ready? He asked. Aisha spun to face him, beaming. More than ready. Don's lips twitched, almost forming a smile, but he caught himself. Let's go. The black SUVs moved smoothly through the streets of Milan, heading for the airport. Don sat beside Aisha, watching her. She was practically bouncing in her seat. You'll give yourself a headache if you keep grinning like that, he muttered. I can't help it. I feel so happy. Don shook his head, but something about her energy was infectious. Then, everything changed. Tires screeched. Gunshots rang through the air. The car jolted violently as the driver swerved. Down! Don barked, pushing Aisha's head down. The windows shattered. More gunshots. Then, pain. A burning sensation tore through Don's shoulder. Aisha screamed as he grunted, pressing a hand to the wound. Before she could process what was happening, strong hands grabbed her and yanked her out of the car. Don! She shrieked, but he was slumped against the seat, his eyes dark with pain. And then, darkness. Aisha's head throbbed as she woke up in a dark warehouse. Her wrists were tied. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. Who took her? Why? Suddenly, the door burst open. Seth. She had never been happier to see someone in her life. Come on, let's go, he urged, cutting her ropes. Don? She asked desperately. He's alive, but we need to move. Gunshots echoed outside as Seth led her through the building. Aisha's legs shook as they ran, but she refused to stop. Outside, Don's men were engaged in a fierce shootout. Seth shielded her as they made their way to a waiting car. The moment she was inside, the car sped off. Her heart was still racing, but all she could think about was, Don. Take me to him. Back at the mansion, Aisha ran inside. Don sat in a chair, his arm in a sling, looking irritated as a doctor tended to him. The moment their eyes met, her vision blurred with tears. She rushed to him, ignoring everyone else. You're hurt. Don sighed. It's nothing. Nothing? She glared at him. You were shot, Don, he smirked. I've had worse. She slapped his good arm. Ow. He raised an eyebrow. Is this how you welcome a man who saved you? I was so scared, she whispered, her voice shaking. His smirk faded. Slowly, he reached out and pulled her into his lap, holding her tightly. "You're safe, Tesoro," he murmured. Aisha buried her face in his neck. She didn't care that people were watching. At that moment, all that mattered was that they were alive. A week later, they arrived in Nigeria. The moment Aisha stepped off the plane, the warm air hit her, and she smiled. "Home," she whispered. Her family was waiting. The moment her mother saw her, she broke into wails of joy, running to hug her. Tears streamed down Aisha's face as she clung to her mother, her father, her siblings. "My daughter!" her mother sobbed. "You came back to us." Don stood back, watching. For the first time, he saw her world, her true world, and something in his chest tightened. Aisha pulled away from her family and turned to him. "Come," she said, holding out her hand. Don hesitated. Then, slowly, he took it. And just like that, he became a part of her world, for better or worse.